Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
To those people on the Zoom platform and on Facebook, and good evening to you fine people this evening. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the 1860 Heritage Center. I was going to start off in a customary Zulu greeting. So, Sanbonani nonke. Thank you. Igamalami Selvan Naitu. So you can see that I'm showing off my skills learning isiZulu online. I've also learned Tamil online, and my Tamil teachers here, so I must pay obeisance to her and say, Vanakkam. Again, thank you for joining us here on this platform. It's indeed wonderful to join you all today, both on the online platform and the on-site platform, to be able to come together after, I think it's 2 years that we've been able to meet. So, and it indeed is an important event and poignant that we should be meeting to celebrate and commemorate a beautiful book. Joanne, I must point out that this book is being launched at the exact time that two ships, namely the Truro and the Belvedere, are on the Indian Ocean at the moment, making their way 161 years ago. So it indeed is a very special moment, and it gives us great pleasure to be able to launch this book at the 1860 Heritage Center. So without me rambling on too much, I must hand over to the affable host, Kiru Naidu, who will introduce the participants and get the proceedings underway. So over to you, Kiru Naidu.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in applauding Joanne Joseph on the publication of Children of Sugarcane. Thank you for joining us here at the 1860 Heritage Center in Derby Street, and let us also greet the audience that are joining us online on the platform of the 1860 Heritage Center. So the advert part of this is that we greet you from the 1860 Heritage Center, which is an agency of the KwaZulu-Natal Department of Arts and Culture. And the partner in this is the Durban Book Fair, whose chairperson is Zandile Kono, who's right here. So say hello quickly, Zandi.
Hello.
Good. And on the panel today to discuss Joanne's book, we have Professor Uma Dupilia Mestri and Dr. Betty Govender. So I'm going to draw them in as we develop this discussion, but I'm pretty sure from looking at the screen, they're all good and connected there. Please forgive me for removing this mask, because there's no other way you're going to be able to see these smoldering good looks if I had the masks on. But forgive me also that with this humidity, my makeup's running all over. So with the pictures, please filter them. Yeah. Well, it's really good that at the center, we're able to play host to you, Joanne, and this beautiful book. I mean, I've seen all the grand accolades for it, but I can just describe it as beautiful. Was it a joy for you to write it?
It was, Kiru. It was a beautiful experience. It took me a very long time. So part of it was a little bit arduous because it took me a long time to learn how to write it after I had developed the idea. But overall, when I think back on the last 9 years during which I wrote intermittently, it actually was a beautiful experience. And it's even more beautiful to see it in print now.
Well, it's always lovely when you get the smell of the newsprint, but you're used to that. You sold 10,000 copies of the last book, and this one's flying off the shelves. And Zandi will attest to it flying off the shelves, because you had a particular experience when you went out to buy it.
Yeah, I was at the airport and I had bought a few other books, and then I left the shop. It was exclusive books at the airport. So I left the shop and I was like, oh, I need to get your book. So I went back and I asked whether the book was available. And I was asking the teller. Then somebody in the back room comes out and he says, oh, are you looking for Joanne's book? We're reading it. We've just been talking about how exceptionally great this book is. It's beautifully written. And I was like, I can't wait to get my hands on it and start reading it.
Isn't that a beautiful accolade? That it's fresh off the press, and even in the bookshop, they're reading the book. Yeah.
It's gratifying. We actually visited a few booksellers today, and I'm so grateful to them, Kiru, for everything that they're putting into. They're putting their hearts and souls into selling this book. I think there's an acknowledgement that it's a South African story that touches everybody, you know, and I'm hoping that, you know, people are going to go out to the bookstores and buy it in the hope of perhaps rediscovering part of their history or part of our shared history in this country.
So that was just the one, yeah, that was just the one, and that was on Friday. So I didn't get to tell you the rest. So I think from about Monday, I started carrying it around with me wherever I went. I was in the Eastern Cape, by the way. And people were captured with the cover of the book. And I think maybe you could speak to us about that.
So that was interesting. In fact, my publicist, Jennifer Ball, and I were having a conversation about this in the car as we were driving around from one bookstore to another today. And we grappled with the cover a lot. There are so many options now, right? Because there are so many things you can do to depict the story visually. And we played around with the idea of animated covers, which are, you know, all the rage at the moment in many areas of publishing. And we decided against it because I wanted something a little more photographic. I thought of all the material actually that sits in the archives that you have shared on your Facebook page and so forth. And I thought, no, there's got to be an image, an arresting image that will encapsulate this experience a little bit better. And that was when we looked into the archives and we actually found these depictions of women cutting sugarcane, carrying sugarcane, and our heart was set on one particular picture that was then developed. And a very close friend of mine, Kravani Pillay, who is a broadcaster herself and grew up on a sugarcane farm, was very helpful to me in developing the image, saying this ought to be the color of the sari. No, we shouldn't go for such a bright color. It's not a wedding sari. We need a white sari for this. The sugarcane is not quite right. It doesn't have the nodes on it that we need. So there was a lot of, you know, back and forth on developing the cover, the tiny little elements of it. And I'm glad with I'm happy with the outcomes, Andy, because a lot of work went into that. Thank you for noticing.
Well, in spite of what people tell you, we always judge a book by its cover.
That's true.
And I hope you all buy this book, because Cedric's got piles of it there. And if you buy the book, Cedric doesn't have to continue eating brown bread and drinking Kool-Aid, you know? If he sells that book, he can, oh, is it? Oh, that's the Jonathan Ball people back there who need to sell it. Gosh, you're confined to a life of poverty without another bestseller, Cedric. No, it's really, and I'm just always excited that people who support the 1860 Heritage Center, and we've had a whole flood of book launches here. This is such a loyal city, and this is a UNESCO City of Literature. So wonderful that you've brought this book to a UNESCO City of Literature. I just want to just delve into some of the background for the book. This genre of historical fiction is really catching fire around the world. We've seen a lot of books come out with that particular approach. Did you think about that particular flavor of historical fiction when you set about writing this?
Kira, I don't know if I consciously did. I think I've been obsessed with historical fiction for a long time myself. I read a lot of it. My husband constantly teases me about watching period pieces on Netflix because I'm obsessed with the past. The past has not been uncovered in its entirety. And the fact that people go back now because we want to know about our past, we want to know about our identity. People are searching all over the world for their roots, for our common origins and so forth. And to go back to these stories and to be able to excavate our history is a beautiful thing. And to think that, you know, over all the centuries, you know, the settings might have been different, the politics might have been different, the societal restrictions might have been different for argument's sake, but actually the human struggle has remained much the same, no matter the context. And that comes through in all this historical fiction. And so I suppose it was inevitable that at some point, all the historical fiction that I consumed was going to haunt me enough for me to want to put it into, or my own part of my own history, into a novel of this nature.
And I think you've done that expertly, and that human story is what comes across very eloquently. So she's probably feeling a bit lonely out there. I want to bring in Deva Rakshanam Govindan. I hope she's online because she gets an honorable mention in the book.
And she deserves it. She earned it.
She does. And she's written lots of human stories. So there's both Deva Rakshanam and Raksha that get mentioned in this book. Thanks for mentioning my mother Lakshmi here too. So we look to see ourselves in these. Betty, lovely to have you. Dr. Betty Govender, who's the doyen of the literary scene in our beautiful city.
Lovely to be here, and lovely.
Please go ahead, Betty. I know you've got a prepared text.
And do I have about 6-7 minutes?
Yes, we'll defer to you. I know you've spent a long time poring over this book and analyzing it, so let's hear you.
Thank you. But don't count the minutes. I'm going to say a few thank yous to. Thank you to my home, my second home, the 1860 Heritage Center, and seeing all of you there. And also, I notice in the audience, the St. Aidan's family, May and Andy, and our family there. Joanne, I feel quite emotional. Also wanted to, I've been told by Sangeetha Brando that there's a rainbow over Durban. So you can imagine how much I'm missing Durban. I'm speaking to you from Johannesburg. Anyway, I'd like to just share my prepared text with you, and I crave your indulgence. Pregs Govender, in her endorsement of Children of Sugarcane, expresses the hope that Shanti's story will inspire others to tell her story. Indeed, Children of Sugarcane is her story. It is the story of slavery, of indenture, its roots and roots, of land and landscape, memory, haunting, remembering and remembering. It's a story of loss, of becoming, of recovery, of restoration. It's a story of home and exile and of belonging, of dereliction, degradation, oppression, both of colonialism and of patriarchy. It's a story of betrayal, but also of sisterhood and camaraderie. The story of the violence of hate, matched only by the violence of love. It's a story of language and growing into critical literacy, of a woman claiming voice, of poetry, of liberation, of transformation. It's a story of imagining, of reimagining. It's a story of the imagination. As Fanon had exhorted us, he said at the end of his grand book, "Make me a body who questions." And we see in the story a woman who questions, a body who questions, who moves from being an object, from being other, from being chattel, to a person, to a subject, to a self. And this is largely in the spirit that Joanne has constructed her story, where there is a woman's voice, a speaking voice, an enunciating self. And so it's in that spirit that I've composed a poem on Children of Sugarcane. And I would say that our beloved Ronnie Govender, if he were there today, he would say that Joanne's book is the song of the Atman, the song of the soul. Or as one of our Chilean writers, Isabel Allende, has said, the song of the soul of a woman. So Joanne, I've composed this letter poem. As you know, the readers will tell you, will remind you that this story is full of letters. And so I'm imagining Joanne writing to her great-grandmother, to her puti, which is the word in Tamil, thanks to Judge Mohini, who informed me about that. And I'm also inspired by Diana Ferris's poem, I Have Come to Take You Home. And so my piece then celebrates Joanne's efforts to write our foremothers into history, into her story. It's about writing women into the present and into the future. So in my poem, I follow Joanne's journey of writing this text poetically, imaginatively, of her writing Children of Sugarcane. And I'm drawing from different modes, but especially, and you will notice this, I'm drawing from Joanne's evocative text itself. So here's the letter poem, I Have Come to Take You Home. It's for Joanne, in search of your mother's, grandmother's, great-grandmother's gardens. It's a letter that Joanne is writing to her great-grandmother. My dearest great-grandmother, I have come to take you home. I rummage in old drawers, linger over scraps of photographs, faded and yellow, seeking you out, lost between the lines of official history, buried under statues and monuments, stifled out, lost in the wind. I fly over the hills and dales, linger on the slopes, cross valleys, tread through the sugarcane fields, swim across the streams, climb the wild banana, read its spreading leaves, lost in reverie, lifted by the wind, searching for your life, shrouded in these hallowed spaces. I have come to take you home. You escape your invisibility, your arranged fate, determined to steer your own life. Stand at the docks, gateway to the high seas. The imposing port gives way to expanse of water that seems to touch infinity. I search for you over the black waters, carried by rocking ships, prison worlds, floating islands, with jahaji bundles, a few pan or tulsi seeds, a holy book, relics to remind you of identity and law, knowledge in the blood. I hover over the steamships, buffeted by the monsoons, watch intently, see you spewed onto the land like detritus, frayed by the passage of history, seeking a rip in time's canvas, see etchings on faces, rigids on hands. I have come to take you home. I follow you to your allotted enclosure. What stories are hidden in this landscape? I see you toiling in the heat of the sun, the prison of the plantations under the southern sky. I hear the weight of your chains as you seek respite in the camaraderie of ship brothers and ship sisters, in the garden paradise turned into hell. I see you now exiled, longing for home across the seas, standing with hands coarsened, bent back with scythe as you face Vakaruchi, your heart turned to the rock-cut temples of home in worship of the great Shiva, remembering the treasure troves of sturdy dynasties before the destruction and dereliction of empires, the landscapes hymned by your ancestors, and the waves of the ocean forever breathing and beating in your breast. You are a migrant connected to your home by fragile threads that now stretch across continents. But while your roots remain in Vakaruchi, it could not hold you. In time, you give in to the subtle beckoning of this continent. You resolve to no longer be a stranger to Africa. You listen harder for her melody in the winds, and embrace her rhythmic dancing in the rains. When you feel you have finally discerned her song, you kneel on her soil and ask her to keep you. I have come to take you home. You learn love and desire, toiling by day and dreaming by night. You learn to read the land of words, the dignity of defiance, as you are led to prison, severed and sundered by history. You do not want your memories denied. You write them in the footpaths and across the sky. You soar eternally over the seas, the sugarcane wafting like ocean waves. No prison will ever confine you. As the lock clangs behind you and their footsteps grow faint, there is a part of you that unlatches from your body, cleaves through its broken skin, and hovers unfettered, leaping those jagged stone walls, gliding between past and present as you search for answers that lead you back to yourself and to me. I have come to take you home. I must free you from the prison house of the past, scatter your spirit across the sky. The sugarcane is singing, dirges and litanies, sighing your name. A keen breeze takes you spiraling upwards and embedding you in the vast night sky. In memory, you defy destiny and write a love song in the stars. I have come to take you home. You have come home, and I have found my home in you, scattered over land and sea and sky. Yours in infinite love, and may your spirit soar eternally. Your loving great-granddaughter, Joanne.
Very beautifully composed. That's really moved you, Joanne.
I don't know if there's much more to say after that, Solvin. That really encapsulates my journey as a writer. And I want to thank Dr. Betty Govender, Auntie Betty.
Auntie Betty will be fine.
Auntie Betty.
And I just wanted to say, I love you, Joanne, and I love all of you there.
Thank you, Auntie Betty. And that has been your involvement in my life since I was a child. Auntie Betty has been a mentor for me over many years, and she was one of the first people to read the first draft of this book 9 years ago. It was a very embarrassing draft, but nonetheless, she encouraged me to press on because she believed that at some point it might be something worthwhile. And Auntie Betty, thank you so much for capturing my relationship to the characters in this novel while I was trying to process my own ancestry. You might notice, if you have seen the book already, that the dedication at the front of the book is to those ancestors who have come before me. To my great-grandmothers on both sides, Atalachmi Velonaikan on my mother's side, Mary Ann Buckingham on the other side, Mary Ann Buckingham Roypen on the other side. To my grandmother, whom I never met, Elizabeth Powers, and my grandmother, Grace Joseph, whom I knew, and to my own mother, May, who is a really stoic example of the kind of power in a woman that has traveled through generations. Apologies, Auntie Betty's poem has made me a bit emotional. But it gives me a sense that there are things that travel through time. When I look at my own mother and the struggles of her life, she was orphaned very young. She was in matric when her parents died. And I was reflecting just today on how her father encouraged her to write her matric exams while he was on his deathbed. My mother wrote her matric exam and went to her father's funeral in the afternoon afterwards. And that is a sense of the kind of stoicism that has traveled through generations of women who have known hardship and hurt and pain and tragedy, but who've overcome it. My mother retired as a school principal a few years ago, sent to a number of schools where there were complicated relationships, staff issues that she was able to sort out because she's an outstanding person who is able to solve conflict and mediate in those sorts of situations really well. But I know, and it became so apparent to me while I was writing this book and researching the history of all indentured women, where this has come from, that they've overcome hardship in such powerful ways to be productive members of South African society. And I'm really proud of that. And I thank you, Auntie Betty, for capturing that in your poem and for capturing my struggle and my personal journey, coming to terms with the reality, the tragic heroism of my own great-grandmother. Thank you for that.
And those words, tragic heroism, you use in the book. So I think there's a very poignant turn of phrase throughout, and we'll return to that. I don't want Uma to get too lonely out there. And as I look across this audience, see several of you university professors. You know the way you do at academic conferences, you sit down and you think for a long time and you write down a question so you get to ask the question in the conference. I want you to be all thinking like that because you're going to have an opportunity to ask some questions from here. So we're not going to leave you out altogether. We really ought to have done this book launch in Selvin's car. Because there he's got all these big speakers and tweeters and subwoofers and so on. So the sound quality would have been a lot better. This is a television personality. Slight interference in her ear and all that troubles her. So we need to get some big speakers in here. But lovely, excuse me, lovely nonetheless. Uma, let's bring you in. Greetings, you're down there in Cape Town. As I was reading Joanne, I was thinking of Gayatri Bahadur and Coolie Woman, and where she talked about the fact that she wrote that book because the woman's voice in indenture was missing. And that was an exceptional piece of research, and we were very pleased, Betty, to receive Gayatri Bahadur right in this city and host her launch. Cedric, yes, at Ike's we did, yeah. And I wrote the review for the Sunday Times, yeah. So, Uma, let's maybe start you off on that point. And Professor Uma Dupilia Mestri, whom we honored a few weeks ago, it's a stellar record of scholarship on this subject and well beyond. We're delighted to have you on this program. Were you hearing the woman's voice in Joanne's book?
So yeah, I sort of have put down a few notes that I wanted to, comments that I wanted to make, but I want to start off by saying, well, Kiru, you asked Joanne, did she enjoy writing this book? And I think the word enjoy was probably not the right word, because Auntie Betty's brought out the true emotion there, the sort of the pain, not the pain of going through this for 7 years and having many drafts and publishers and copy editors and that painful process, but the pain of the connection. And, that this book comes from a very deep personal space. And I think Auntie Betty, who has become simply brilliant, in these last few years, producing all these poems. So I have a suggestion to make that when, Joanne, your book is going to get sold out very quickly. I mean, it's flying because it's hitting a public nerve. And so when you do your next edition, please publish Auntie Betty's poem at the back of the book, because I think it goes beautifully with the whole book, and it is very powerful. So just keep in mind that. So I actually thought, that asking a historian to speak at a literary function where there's a novel that's based on history is actually a very boring thing to do, because historians can be incredibly boring. I teach a course on film and history, and we prescribe some historians' critiques of films, and they are so pedantic. Oh, this fact is wrong, and that could not possibly be so. And they look for this kind of detail, and they actually critique the creative imagination of the directors. So I'm going to try and not be that boring historian today. And I'm glad that we have Kiru and Auntie Betty, who are both literary forces themselves. So, the Joanne's book reminded me about a number of things. So one of the things, it reminded me of 1980s UDW, when we had this very bright academic, Joe Beale, who was a lecturer in the history department and who produced one of the first academic writings on the indentured women. This was in the 1980s, absolutely beautiful work. And since then, I'm reminded about the works of Pranisha Badase, who looked at sort of the household and domestic servants, and Nafisa Issap Sheikh, who's looked at the law and marriages, and also the biographies that emerge from Ghulam and Ashwin's very lovely book, Inside Indenture. In fact, the compelling story about the irrepressible Voti. You can't forget Voti after you read that particular book. So Kiru, your point about Gayatri Bahadur's book is absolutely on point. I mean, when I was reading Joanne's book, I pulled out this book and I read it again. And here we have two people writing about their great-grandmothers and the search for the past. And it took Gayatri in a different direction into the archives and, pouring into that. And in Joanne's case, she resorted to fiction, but fiction based on a very careful reading of the scholarly literature. So, they both, and what struck me about both, and it took time to get to that point in Joanne's book, whereas Gayatri's book is actually, violence is at the heart of everything in Gayatri's book. From the beginning to the end, violence just tears through that book. And I was beginning to wonder now, is Shanti's story going to be different? And violence is absolutely at the heart of this book as well. The violence of the system, the violence that particularly women and men both endured violence, but women endured a particular type of violence. And so this violence finds its way here. So I also, I just was full of other texts kept coming into mind. So I was thinking of Andre Brink's Chain of Voices, which is one of the most brilliant, novels, fictions about slavery, but based on a true story in which he uses many voices. So that is, like the central text for slavery. If you want to talk about slavery instead of academic texts, I used to use Andre Brink's Chain of Voices to teach about Cape slavery many, many years ago. But I also thought about Imran Kuvadia, a young Imran Kuvadia, who in 2001, that's 20 years ago, talked about this movement between India and South Africa and wrote about this Indian trader and his wife who come to Durban, and the joys for the reader of reading about central Durban and the characters in Durban and the food that he was eating and so forth. So John Coetzee's endorsement of that book spoke volumes in a line of brevity, in which he called Imran's work a tender love story rendered in prose of dazzling comic wizardry. So the creative part dominated considerably in Kuvadia's book. It's the story. But 20 years later, we have Imran now endorsing Joanne's new book as one that brings to life the different and simultaneous worlds, India, South Africa, Madras, and Port Natal. So what I wanted to say is really there is a power of fiction to reach the public that is thirsty to discover its roots. And like visual images which conjure up a world to which the viewer says, that's my great-grandfather or great-grandmother, and that's their world. Joanne's book, through the process of words and a story that is her own, creates a world of indenture. And I found that it actually does. I kept thinking, what is it that us historians can't do? And it's historians, we are bound by our footnotes and sources. I think we might write better history if we were freed from, this text, the sources. But we have to be bound by these historical conventions. But what Joanne does is to take us into the thoughts of the indentured women. Throughout the book, we are privy to the thoughts of Shanti. And I found in particular that it made time real for me. So as a historian, we would say, well, it took 21 days to come from Madras to Natal. But in Joanne's book, in Shanti's story, you feel that journey tremendously. It's a story of leaving the village, from her decision to leave for indenture, to that transitional depot that she's taken on, to Madras when she finally reaches Madras. Then there's a further wait, to the journey by ship, to the wait again, and then the long walk on arrival to Tongaat. Now that fills in many, many pages. It's a very substantial portion of the book. And I think I have to say, it's the part of the book that I enjoyed or felt really the most. And also, of course, the story of what happens on the indentured estate. But what I wanted to also say is that in 2003, there was one book that crept in very quietly. I don't know how many of you know this book. It is a book by Prabha Mudli, The Heart Knows No Color. And it quietly hit the bookshelves. And I don't think, we don't have Facebook and we don't have Zoom and all that. Zoom, in some ways, I would have loved to be at Gayatri Bahadur's book launch, but we didn't have access to that. So this particular book was the story of an indentured woman, Sita, who worked on a sugar estate. Now, I actually enjoyed this book a lot, but it fell into the category of an Indian Mills and Boon. So Sita falls in love with the estate owner's relative, a white Englishman. And so it's the romance between these two, not the violence between an estate owner and, the character. But it did strike me, I did enjoy the book because it took you into the lack of freedoms and the searing conditions of mill workers, but Sita's own integrity and agency. It's also a story of mobility. So what happens after indenture? Now, I wanted to make comments about Joanne's book is that in inventing this particular story, Joanne made very particular choices about her subject. So this woman was not kidnapped. She was not forced onto the ships. She was not a sex worker. Shanti chooses to be indentured. Shanti is educated. And maybe Joanne needs to talk about why she chose to make her educated, a literate person, somebody who can read, who can speak English, and who, but she's also a strong woman. She works on the sugar estate as a field laborer, and she doesn't go from man to support herself. She actually has love with a single person there, and she is very much in control. She's a very, very strong, particular person, but even Shanti cannot choose a world where there's no violence. The very nature of indenture is violence. And there's a beautiful sentence there about the stain of indenture. It's a very powerful sentence that's there somewhere, in which Joanne talks about the stain of indenture and how none of them can actually escape this. So I want to end off by reading a few paragraphs that really struck me. And I think maybe it would have been nice for Joanne to choose her favorite paragraphs in the book, but these are some of my favorite things that captured my imagination. So there's firstly Ramdeen, the shopkeeper. So this is Joanne now. His rotund stomach and bulbous nose would come into view first as he rounded the corner, followed by the rest of his bulk. He bound it and his nether regions in a skimpy yellow dhoti. A constant itch must have animated from below, because he often reached down to scratch it in full view of his customers, and it would examine his nails afterwards. His hair was an oil slick that crept down like ivy around the double chin. As historians can't really write like this, unless you Ashwin, I think. So Ratilal, I liked this particular description. So when Shanti gets to the transit stop, a short rodent-like man emerged from a building nearby. This was Ratilal, who was middle-aged, thin and slightly hunched, which gave him a sinister air. He kept his body perfectly still while moving his head rapidly in all directions, much like an owl. He had cultivated a mustache that almost looked as though it had been drawn on. From the black staining his temples, I guessed that he dyed his hair. Like Ramdeen, his hair had been slicked back and with a generous lashing of coconut oil. He parted his teeth to reveal a rattish smile. So Ratilal. You know, Shanti is this very thoughtful person who thinks in really good English and who also speaks. So, you know, you constantly encounter this, but one of my most favorite characters in the book, and you could miss her, but it is Chinema. And Chinema has an African spouse, Mzilikazi. And, you know, I'm not giving away the story here. I think it's very dangerous to give away a story. But Shanti goes to see Chinema. And this is how Chinema speaks. Don't worry, I heard he gets tired of one girl easily. Soon he gonna leave you and look for one another girl. And so violent he is. My friend was one ayah in his house, looking after his children. It's one of the few paragraphs in the book which has this kind of language. And so I don't know if Joanne wants to reflect on this, but I'm coming to the end of this Kiru before you think I'm going to take you to midnight. But there's also a powerful paragraph on Africa. I invited her potent son to darken me. Now this is Shanti, and this is how Shanti speaks in the book. I invited her potent son to darken me. I listened harder for her melody in the winds and embraced her rhythmic drumming in the rains. And when I felt I had finally discerned her song, I knelt on her soil and I asked her to keep me. So I'll stop there, but I have another, you know, lovely paragraph. It's actually very long, but it is about what Imran says the book is about. It's about these spaces, these different worlds, India and South Africa. And there's it's about a page long in which Shanti reflects considerably about India, the loss of her parents, and not being able to see them, the loss of her village. And then she reflects on what she has in this colony of Natal. So I'll just stop there. And I think there's a lot to read in this book. But I would say that it's the first 2/3 of the book that actually gripped me considerably, but I won't tell you what appears in the last third of the book, last section of the book. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Uma. Selvin, I want you to turn the camera around just to pan across the audience, because I want Uma to be really jealous that, you know, they do all kinds of book things in Cape Town, but look at this full house in Durban on a Friday night. So give yourselves a round of applause. So beautiful to have an audience for books in this UNESCO City of Literature. And Uma, I want you to hold the thought about Voti, because Joanne tells us that she studied Desai and Vaid's book like a Bible, and they maintain that Voti disappears from the archives. And in the course of Selvin and I scratching around, we may well have found Voti, who we think emerges as a sort of Matahari, a spy for the Boers during the Anglo-Boer War. So we might have to call on your detective skills, because we think we might have tracked Voti down again, and it'd be fascinating to find her descendants and things, who may have names like Terre Blanche and things like today. Yeah, no, really good. Well, I'm sure that that analysis touched you.
Gosh, there's so much that Uma said there that I want to touch on. And Uma, all credit to you, because I must actually thank you personally for providing a certain visual element that I could not conceive of when I was writing the book. So Uma has written many fine articles, and I've read all of them, and the text is just so dense with information, and Uma is such a brilliant historian. And I disagree that historians are boring, Uma, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But Uma, one of Uma's most beneficial books to me personally was From Cane Fields to Freedom. Because no matter how you conceive of 19th century Port Natal in your mind, or any other space in your mind, until you have seen visual representations of that, it's extremely difficult to actually understand what it looked like, how people dressed, their stance and demeanor in the pictures that they took. You know, for me, that book was really pivotal because it married text with exquisite pictures that were beautifully curated. And it told the story of indentured people and people in other, who then moved on to other professions from that point onwards. And the progression of the Indian community in South Africa. So it was such an important book for me in the development of Children of Sugarcane. When Uma says historians are boring, I must remind her that writers are lazy. So actually, historians do all the hard work, Kiru, as you know, that writers don't really want to do. We do not want to spend years digging up research that doesn't exist for a fictional novel, to be honest. What we want to do, and what our mission is, I suppose, as writers, is to take the existing body of knowledge that we can trust, because it comes from historical experts, and transpose that onto a story that is likely to be consumed, perhaps on a commercial or more popular basis.
Thank you for acknowledging the historians and keeping them in business. You know, she's just retired now, but I think she's going to be busier in this great emeritus role that she has. I must tell you, Uma, the Gujarati shoemakers that you wrote about, one of them at the bottom of Boer Kaap is keeping a pair of Germans for me there. So I knew his backstory before we went to the shoe shop. And so those are the kinds of subjects somebody like Uma goes out and ferrets. Another very interesting thing that she pointed out right here, that sometime in the 1950s, the majority of the Indian population in Cape Town disappeared. Just disappeared from the record books and from the population register altogether. And she found all of that out, or made that analysis. And the effect was that with the Mixed Marriages Act, the Population Registration Act, and the Group Areas Act, and all those ugly things that came about then, that if you reclassified yourself as colored, you had a better chance in the Cape than if you were Indian. So if you were Indian, they stuck you in Rylands, but if you were colored, you could go all over the Western Cape. So that's how the Indian people disappeared there. But this excavation of ancestry, this is my sister's daughter back here, says, she looks at me very fondly. I felt like Oprah earlier when the both of you were crying, you know, like I brought the tears out in you. But she's just come back from the Eastern Cape with some ancestral excavations of her own, looking for her grandmother's grave and looking beyond the mountains of Tala. And just tell us a few words about that as you hear Joanne's story of unpacking her own ancestry. That part of your own ancestry, how has that touched you?
Let me first greet Professor Uma and Auntie Betty.
Hi there.
Auntie
Hi,
Betty,
Zandila. Lots of love.
love to you both as well. You know, what do young people say? I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready
You
for
were
that.
never ready.
I really wasn't ready for that, Auntie Betty. And the way that she has written the poem just brought out all of these emotions for me.
And Zandila,
Yes,
I wanted to say that I had it in my notes about Auntie Phyllis and about telling the stories and still waiting for answers. That's why I wanted to end with the Miriam Makeba song, waiting literally till the cows come home to tell the stories of those who are lost, those who've been suppressed.
Yes.
That was there at the back of my mind, but I'll talk to you later.
all right, Auntie Betty. So that poem coupled with this journey, because I'm somewhere in the middle and I don't want to pace through it, and I wasn't wanting to pace through it in preparation for here. So I said, I'm not going to do that because I want to enjoy the beauty of the book. So what was your question exactly, Kira?
Ancestral excavation.
I say this with the most respect. When you feel that much emotion from what Auntie Betty's just invoked, it's very difficult to put that into words. Yeah, so I went to the Eastern Cape, stood on soil that my grandmother would have stood on in the 1890s. So yeah, that was my trip to the Eastern Cape. Just
The uncle who's the oral historian.
Uncle who's the oral historian. Kira, there's a lot here now.
But you've got to write a book. Yeah.
I'm thinking that. I'm really thinking that because on the other side of my ancestry, I have a grandmother who took her father to court to stay in Natal. So he was on his way back to India, and she goes to court and interdicting him from returning, or well, taking her with to India. So through all of this, you know, I'm just a panelist. I shouldn't be sharing my stories. Yeah.
Oh, lovely, Zandi. Other thing I must teach you is we don't put the book down because of Boma Devi. Yeah, so that's why I'm battling with this mic and the book. All right. We'll come back to those themes in a moment, Joanne, but maybe we can open it up to the floor, just some observations or brief questions or comments. Please don't all rush at once. Yes. You want to just maybe say a word of who you are so that the people watching it who don't know you get a sense of who you are? Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Devonish. I'm historian based at Wits. I'm just down actually to do some research in the Gandhi Lutuli archives for for a week or two. So I'm delighted to be here. And I was taken up by the interesting discussion about the relationship between literature and history and historians and writers and the sort of relationship between the two disciplines. And you mentioned that writers are lazy. They like the historians to do the work. But it sounds to me like you had to go into the archives and do a lot of research yourself. And I'd be interested to know, were there particular sources or documents that spoke to you that really helped you to put the story of your protagonist together?
Thank you. Selvan, you want to, maybe we'll take a cluster of questions so we get it together. And Annie, thank you for your beautiful work on Phyllis. You've spent hours and hours in those archives working through those letters. Her aunt is Phyllis also. Yeah. Goody. Okay. Any more questions out there? Yes. Back there. Well, shall we just take a cluster of it so you get to answer it? Yeah. No, the chairman will remember. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Kiru. My cousin and a niece of mine are writing the history of my grandmother, who was an indenture. And she came from India with a child in 1899. She served 5 years as an indenture at the railways. So she didn't have the experience of the sugarcane. We don't know, there's such a large gap, and Kiru very kindly took me to the archives in Maritzburg, you remember. And
Rajwanta's story.
Yeah, we found reams and reams on my grandfather, who came as a passenger Indian. So we had a lot of information on him, but nothing on my grandmother. Since then, Betty kindly sent me some information that I can get from the archives. And of course, with lockdown, haven't been able to get there. We're hoping now to fill in those gaps. But my cousin lives in Edinburgh. My niece lives in Cape Town. And with me here, it's a bit of a challenge, but still, we're managing. There's so much. I've been influenced, of course, by Gayatri Bahadur's book, which is very similar to The Journey, but even more so, I think, was Sea of Poppies, which was by Amita Ghosh. It was so much the story of my grandmother. You know, she came with a child as well, but hers was fictional. Ours is actually trying to trace the real story of what happened. My grandmother must have been an extremely brave and enterprising woman. Yes, she was a widow, had been ostracized by her family. She's listed as Muslim in the ship's record. Her child is also, his name is Hanib. She came from Ghazipur, which is also a Muslim district. But, you know, we can't really, the way we look at things with Muslim, Hindu, so on, might not have even been like that then. It might have been acceptable at that time. We don't know this, lots and lots of gaps. So we're trying to trace her journey. We've done the first blog and that's been out. We're busy now with the second one, but very exciting stories to tell. And I need to get back to the archives. But I was hoping I could get some help from you, Joanne, maybe. And of course, Betty's also been very helpful. So yeah, that's my story. And it's a very much a work in progress.
And really very good work. Well done on how far you've come thus far. Any other questions? Yes, Cedric.
Good evening. Cedric Sissing, ex-Adams Books.
You don't need to introduce yourself in this audience, Cedric.
And I currently with Ike's Books. Joanne, the obvious question, I'll ask the obvious question, it's going to come up, I'm sure. The choice between a work of fiction or not in novel form, prose, as opposed to the historical, the memoir. Was it an immediate decision? You already had made that up pretty much 9 years ago, or were you more influenced later by the access to the fantastic resources that we have here? You've mentioned Inside Indenture and Uma's book, to possibly then go the memoir biography route.
Good. Let's work with those three. I hope you've remembered all of them. Yeah, and those archives we were talking about, I think it was Surendra Bana that said that there were 70 linear meters of boxes in the archives in Pietermaritzburg that are untouched. So if you think, we were ferreting out pieces of material that nobody has touched since the late 19th century, there's just so much that's there for historians and writers to pour through. But let's hear your take on these three questions and comments.
So Annie, thank you so much for your question. Yay, a fellow Witsi. Thank you for being here tonight. Essentially, fiction is a very powerful way of assisting people to access history. And it's such a pity because when you go to the archives and when you go to the work of the great historians in our country, and they are great historians because they've told these stories so brilliantly, documented these lives and the reality of these lives so beautifully. There is suddenly a foundation for you to be able to take this and put this into the popular domain and say, you may not have known about it before, and you may not have sat in a classroom or a lecture hall where you were able to access this before, but here it is now. Here is the work of our great historians in a narrative. So Annie, there are so many historians whose work I was deeply dependent on. Inside Indian Indenture was a huge one for me. And it was the way it was written, really, that it had been woven into such a palatable narrative that it was easy for me to follow and easy for me to integrate the stories into my novel that made an impression on me. So particularly the stories of women and how they were affected by this. I'm very grateful for that book that really focused a lot on the fate of women. And then, when Uma mentioned, for example, Pranisha Barasi's thesis, actually, my blood became hot. There were so many aspects of the book where I had to go into delve into these different types of history. So I needed to know more about the court system. I needed to know about the criminology of the time, how they interpreted certain things in murder cases, for argument's sake. And there it was in this particular thesis, that it was just the exact perfect information that I needed to integrate into my book. And so as I worked through these different sections, it was Uma's writing, it was Kalpana Hiralal. Interestingly, with my own grandmother, great-grandmother, she appears in the archive on the ships, and then she disappears. I don't know anything about her, and all of a sudden I come across Ashwin Desai Gulambayed and Tembisa Waichen's book on many lives, 150 years of being Indian in South Africa. And there, lo and behold, is a picture of my great-grandmother, the first picture of my great-grandmother that I stumble upon at Ike's bookshop while I'm looking for information on the past. And there she is, sitting, and I wish I'd brought that picture because I didn't know how to read it the first time I looked at it. But there she is, sitting in what I think is probably her finery, the finest clothes that she had. There is another woman standing next to her who could be her sister, potentially, because she came to South Africa with a younger sister. And there's a little boy in the picture as well. And both of those individuals are unidentified. But there, 160 years later, I come face to face with my great-grandmother. And that is one of the most powerful moments. I look into the past. And if only she could have looked into the future and known, like all the other indentured laborers, what our lives would have been like now because of what the foundation they laid. Anyway, that's an aside. But those are the sorts of historians whose work that I used. It's very mainstream history. It's jovial, joy brain, all of those who, and Nafisa Sheikh, Aesop, the various parts of the book required different input. And so even Zainab Dalla's reflections on going back to the very place where her great-grandfather would have been harnessed like an animal crushing sugarcane. That image stayed with me. Auntie Betty's poem that she shared with me, a personal one, I'm not sure if it has been widely published, but it is a story of her grandmother picking tea leaves in Kersney. All of those informed the history of the book. So it's fairly mainstream as academia goes, perhaps not as mainstream as fiction goes. But I was totally, extremely dependent on those sources for the information I gathered. Cedric, Leni, if you don't mind, Auntie, I'm going to come to Cedric's question simply because it's somehow related. Cedric, for me, it was always going to be a fictional novel. I am partly an academic. I am studying towards a literature degree that deals with indenture, but I'm not a historian. And that's why I credit the historians with the incredible work they do, because I'm not actually capable of that work, but I am capable of imagining around that work. And much of my career has involved distilling information. So taking information that may be complex and distilling it down to a form that almost democratizes it in a way and allows many, many people access to it. And so it was always going to be a fictional novel. The archives don't reveal enough about my great-grandmother anyway for me to have written a book about her life, interesting woman though she was. But it was always going to be a fictional novel because I'm also obsessed with reading fiction. It is my favorite genre. Thanks, Cedric. Auntie, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. But
Kasturi.
Auntie Kasturi. So I mean, I'm sure you've done some of the work I did already in accessing the archives, because that would probably have been your starting point. And I'm sure you're aware that the archives that sit in Pretoria have been digitized. So that is probably an easy way to access some of this information. I went onto these archives, and I was able to find quite a bit of information about my father's side of the family, because they were passenger Indians. And of course, that journey, as you say, is better documented. So I found birth certificates, marriage certificates, baptism certificates, my great-grandmother's marriage certificate when she was married. But what helped was that they were Anglican, and the church had its own archive, well, yes, its own archives, its own record of births, deaths, marriages, and so forth that actually enabled me to find more information. But I was also able to find some information in those archives about my great-grandmother, about the ship she arrived on, the town she came from, which was Salem, the fact that she traveled with her two siblings, her two younger siblings, and the fact that one of those siblings, the brother, left Port Natal 1 year after arriving here, injured. He left, he was marked as an invalid on the ship's list, which says to me that I know she worked on the Natal government railways. I don't know where the other siblings were set to work, but I do know that he might have, if he'd been on a plantation or on the railways, he might have been injured, and he might have been sent back to India, which means we have relatives who were there that stem from that sibling. So the archives, I mean, not all of it is digitized, but I did find it quite useful in my search. If you can go onto the internet and look for the National Archives.
Oh, very good, Joanne. Somewhere in the book you write about the injustice of old age. And I'm starting to feel my bum getting a bit sore on the seat. So I'm not going to keep you here all night. And as I'm looking at the back at those samosas, that chow looks much better than the biryani we had at the political meeting we came from, Logi. You know, this is election time, you get a lot of biryani. But so I don't want to keep you from that. Is that a question or you want to campaign? Yes, very quickly, Logi. Yep. I must tell you, Joanne, that your friends and colleagues in the media have been very supportive of you. I've been reading the reviews from various people, and Krivani and Shantini and others, and that's just been magnificent. So it's Yatin sanitizing the mic. And I'm very pleased to see Ashok Ramsarup there as well, who's also the doyen of the media in Durban, who had great influence on my life and career as well. So I'm always grateful to you, Daddy-o. Logi.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I just wanted to make a comment. This year, I met a lady who came up to me and said, you know, your great-grandfather was on the ship with my grandmother. And her grandmother tells the story that my great-grandfather carried her for part of the journey from Madras to South Africa. Now, my great-grandfather, Ramya Sadanaidu, left Port of Chennai, Madras, because he didn't like this arranged marriage that his family had organized. So he jumped into the ship and came into Africa, landed in the port of Durban, and he walked 40 kilometers to the Tongat sugar mill, where he got the job. That's why I hail from Tongat. That's where my family is from. And it's these wonderful stories that make me want to read a book about the children of the sugarcane, because I grew up in the sugar fields of Tongat, and I hope one day to write my book from the cane fields to the mayor's parlor. Thank you.
Very good, and thank you for that recollection and the great work you do in public service, Logi Naidu. He neglected to mention that his grandfather came on the open deck in the full sun.
Colorism, Kiru.
We both started work in the Metro Police, so you can see the both of us looking this way. Yes, okay. You want to make an observation on that, or shall we start to round things up? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe just some closing thoughts, and for a second, I'd like to bring Betty and Uma in, if you're keen, and to thank everybody else who's on that screen following us. And you know, the 1860 Heritage Center has a formidable following all over the world. So wherever you're watching us from and contributing on the comments, we're grateful for all of the participation in these programs, including and in particular the people who join us here today. Maybe some closing reflections. And well, maybe let me ask you this. There's one criticism of this kind of writing, that we are tearfully and forever stuck in the past, and we beat ourselves up over these sorry and painful stories of indenture. When is somebody going to write about all of those people that have made good and were looking forward and uniting the country and building the country and so on?
Kiru, we've already written about those people, and we're writing about them all the time, and that is fantastic. But we've got a hole in our history as Indian people in this country.
Mm-hmm.
We think our culture's Bollywood.
Mm-hmm.
You ask young Indian people what their culture is, they don't know the story.
Mm-hmm.
Again, my publicist and I were having a chat about this a little bit earlier on today. I interviewed Heather Morris last week. She is the author of the Tattooist of Auschwitz. You know, there was a trilogy. I forget, Silka's Journey was the second one, and now she's done the third book called Three Sisters. And I asked her about the choice she made to give each of these books a very light feel. So they're all set in Auschwitz. They're set in Birkenau, you know, the most horrific place, the very heart of the Holocaust. And yet Heather manages to give them a very light feel. And I asked her, was that a conscious choice? Why did you choose to do that? She said, well, thousands of books have been written about the Holocaust and Auschwitz. We know what happened there. So I'm not going to repeat that. I'm focusing on the most human stories, the human interaction between individuals, those intimate relationships that gave people hope and helped them out of those situations. We don't have those books. Mm-hmm. Where are the thousands of books on indenture? We have books coming out of Fiji. We have books coming out of British Guiana. People like Gautra Bahadur who are writing these excellent books. We do not have that canon in South Africa. It's a very small canon. And people like Aziz Hassam have written about the horror of indenture. It hasn't been made as widely available as it should have been. Some of the other stories have been given a lighter treatment. So, Kiru, in my view, we need to actually go back and we need to tell the story, not dressed up in any way, but the way it actually happened. Of course, this is a representation of history and not a historical textbook. It is a fictional novel. But I wanted to do the work of exposing the human rights abuses of that time. I want every South African and every African to know what happened during indenture. And when we are ready to digest our history and to move forward with the positive stories, I'm happy for us to do that.
Fair enough. I think you've said that very well. I think it's a very powerful argument. A closing statement, Uma. Is there a hole in our history?
Yeah, I actually think a book like Joanne's should actually be, it could be matric reading prescribed for school kids. It could be at universities. And it's a kind of book that I would hope that it shouldn't just touch those who have indentured roots, but I think it should touch all South Africans so that, that we all get an understanding of everybody's experiences. So that's my wish, is that, a book like this would make it into, be a prescribed text. And in that way, a little bit of history, but also, enjoying a literary novel, a creative piece, it serves both purposes.
Great. No, thank you for that, Uma. A closing word from you, Betty?
Yes, I agree with Joanne and Uma and the others. This is part of our collective inheritance. This is part of our collective histories. And you'll remember the book, What is Slavery to Me?, written by our feminist scholar, Pumla Kola. It's the same. Everyone should be asking, what is slavery to me? What is indenture to me? And I wrote, you will recall, an essay on Chinese indenture when Darrell Oconee wrote the story of 4 generations of Chinese in South Africa. And this history that Joanne's written is very much about how we live today. It's very much about the present. And there's all this glib talk about social cohesion and about unity and understand. And it's very relevant to the state of the nation today and how we really need to understand what a vibrant critical democracy means. Not just about where we've come from, but in many ways, how we really are one people. And the fact that my grandparents came from India and I have Indian roots, but that's what I tried to say in my poem. It's also about I'm born in Africa. My mother was born in Africa and I belong to this continent. And so there is this appreciation of the many roots that make me. And for me, that's where we need to go at this moment if we're going to build a democracy. I mean, in my book, Sister Outsiders, I'm talking about people like Fatima Mir and Phyllis Naidu, who are writing to the land of their birth, South Africa, writing to the continent, the land of their birth that denied them, that denied my mother, because my mother died not having the rights to vote in the land of her birth, nor did my grandmother, who came from India. She died before India got its independence. She died in 1940. She died just 6 months after Indian independence.
Lovely, Betty. Thank you. So that's the Empire Writes Back. Yes. Thank you for that. Sandeep, can I ask you to do an advert for the Durban Book Fair in your 60 seconds and just say a quick word to this audience about our weekend program as well?
Before I do that, now I'm inspired. going back to what you were speaking about earlier, or what you were trying to ask me about when I was just so overwhelmed with the emotion, and talking about the social cohesion, I think a story of grandmothers, one on the Amaxhosa land dispossession, and you have Indian great-grandmothers with indentured history. I mean, so we in 2021, it took you 9 years, no? 2031?
Not the fastest writer.
No. I would be the same, you know, might take me 15 years, but I think Kiru's onto something there. Durban Book Fair, I think I see familiar faces here. So Durban Book Fair is a voluntary organization. We don't get paid for it. We provide a platform for all types of authors from all genres. And we are at the Mitchell Park. We travel sometimes. We've been at Belito. We are at the Pick and Pay, Hyper by the Sea on certain days. So follow our Facebook page. If you can't, or if you don't have Facebook, like Uncle Logie over there, speak to Kiru. So we are at the Mitchell Park on the last Sunday of the month. I don't know, sometimes I come, sometimes I don't come. It just depends on my schedule. But at the Mitchell Park on the last Sunday of every month.
Well, it remains for me to thank our author, Joanne Joseph, and I think she deserves another clap, clap, clap. Wonderful work and really beautiful how well it's been received by all. And to thank our panelists, Uma Dupilia Mestri, Pregs Govender, and Sandile Kono. Very pleased that you were able to contribute in all of this. And since we're a mutual appreciation society, let me acknowledge Selvan Naidu and Yatin Singh and all of the folks attached to the, and Kogi Chinnapan and others attached to the 1860 Heritage Center. This is one of the liberated spaces in our city, the fact that we could sit down here and have discussions of this sort, and Professor Reddy manages the History Society. So there's a lot going on in here, and I'm very pleased that you and your publishers have decided to bring this book to this particular spot, because I think that this is a hub and hive of literary and intellectual activity, and we must all work to keep this center alive by supporting its programs and always put pressure on the powers that be to keep this place open, because this is a great space and real work, good work is done here. So thank you, all the folks at the 1860 Heritage Center and all of you who are joining us online. I don't think, Selvan, you want to show your face again here, because this was the best kurta my neighbor had and I had to wear it today. So let me take some of the limelight. Yes, we are. And forget the barfi cake and the samosas and so on. The book's out here, and let's ask the author, how much is the book there? 300 Rand. Jonathan Ball published this book, and Adams is here with it. It's wonderful that you're here with the author and you'll get her to sign the book, and just for a small 300 Rand. And it's a first edition. So, you know, first editions can be very valuable because it's going to go into a second edition that's not going to be as valuable as you're getting it tonight. So please, everybody, make sure you leave with the book and get Joanne to sign it. And thank you all very much for supporting literature in our city especially. Thank you and have a good evening.
And please keep some